extra long. I don't know. Sorry. Yeah, so I guess FYI for everyone, it's being recorded. So if you don't want your face to be recorded, sorry, we should have said that before we started. Just put your camera off. Yeah, because I think the idea is that we will record it and then we can use it for like social media and put it onto YouTube and stuff so that people can access it further down the line. Miranda, I don't know, is it going to be so that it can just be the speaker view? Do you know what I mean?
I've pinned you both, so you are both the sort of spotlight, but there should be probably a bit of a ribbon of faces. So if you're not comfortable with being recorded, then I would suggest turning off the video screen.
Okay. So I think I'm seeing it slightly different. Anyways, and then there's also Claire, who's from the Canny Little Library, who is hosting this kind of collaborative talk between the three groups, organisations and individuals. So thank you all for coming. I'm just going to quickly outline the running order for the evening, and then we'll have a little intro from Claire about the library, and then Leah is going to kindly read us an extract from her book. That's great. And then we're going to show a very short film. 1 second, sorry. Yeah, which is from a demonstration a couple of years ago outside the Home Office in London that was done in solidarity with hunger strikers inside Yarlswood Women's Detention Centre. After that film, I'll give a little talk about the Abolish Detention campaign, and then we'll show another little film, which is actually from protests inside and outside of the Yarlswood Women's Immigration Detention Centre. And then we'll have a little discussion with Leah. And then we'll be open up for Q&A. As there's like not tons of time, the priority for the Q&A is for people with lived experience. If people would like to share their experiences of detention or the hostile environment, etc., then this is very much a space for you to do that. As well as if people have questions, then put them in the chat and hopefully we'll get through to them. We're going to aim to finish, well, we are going to finish at 8:30, so that should be before iftar for anyone that's fasting. So yeah, welcome everyone. Nice to see you all. Claire, do you want to kick us off with a little intro about the library?
Yep, I will. Can everyone hear me okay? Great, spot on. I'm just going to read this off a script, otherwise, if let loose, I could talk about the library all night, so it's safer to read from a script. So yeah, hello everyone, my name's Claire Brown. I'm one of the volunteers here at the Canny Little Library, Newcastle. We're really excited to be hosting tonight's event with Abolish Detention. For those who don't know about our library, we're a volunteer-run radical library, which is housed at the Star and Shadow Cinema, which is about a 10-minute walk away from the centre of Newcastle. During lockdown, we've been really lucky to receive funding to update our collection with new books in categories such as gender, queer, disability and disability justice, activism, Black liberation, decolonisation, children's books, as well as refreshing our queer zine collection. And we've also been doing door-to-door COVID-friendly deliveries in and around the Newcastle area. We've also hosted an online event in December gone. We ran an event called Stay at Home, Stay Queer, which was a creative writing and zine making workshop with a local trans and non-binary zine maker, Melody Sprouts. And one of our volunteers also runs a monthly online abolition reading group. So yeah, if you're interested in reading a copy of Leah's book, which I've got here, and I love the cover, I've been posting about it online all day. See, I'm going off script now. Where am I again? Yeah, so if you're interested in getting a copy of that book, we've got a few copies, or if you're interested in getting involved with any, you find about any of our other new books, or getting involved with being a volunteer, you can help curate the library, cataloguing, helping run with social media, putting on events, or help maybe set up a No Borders reading book group. Would love to hear from you. You can contact us via our socials, and I'll drop them in the chat in a second. But you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and as of today, Twitter, thanks to Miranda. And with that, I'll pass over to Leah for the reading. I'm really excited. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real kind of pleasure to be speaking with everybody today. I'm going to kick off with an extract, which is just the kind of introduction of the book, really, to, yeah, I guess kind of set the scene for the topics we're going to be jumping into. And the introduction is titled, "Why Break Down Borders?" Borders are indisputably sites of violence. Borders create citizens and non-citizens, aliens and nationals, undocumented people and sans-papiers, foreigners and expats. Borders segregate, categorize and dehumanize us. They are the product of long histories of injustice, which means that we, our flesh, bones, and the very breath which keeps us alive, can be crudely termed illegal in the eyes of the law. The phrase illegal immigrant, which in Britain creeps from newspaper headlines to state policies and back again, encourages us to believe that we can be a violation of law and order as it is sold to us. However, laws and order are not objective truths, and borders have not always existed. Immigration laws, for example, are ideas crafted in the imaginations of the powerful to maintain their position and preserve the world as they like it. Borders are not real. The criminal justice system and its agents, such as border force, prisons, and the police, an institution founded to protect private property and break up workers' strikes, all function to uphold laws and protect the status quo of inequality. They do not keep the peace. These structures bring the violence. Laws try to rationalize the border regime, which fundamentally ignores the humanity of those who move. Knowing this, let's take as our root and starting position the reality that no human is illegal. In this book, I draw connecting lines between Britain's murky past and the precarious present of the UK border regime. Through interrogating Britain's imperial history, we can better understand the current context of immigration laws, political agendas, and structures of inequality which prop up the border. These chapters explore the purpose and consequences of borders, sometimes imagined as benign geographical markers, drawing out where one country ends and another begins. Through knowing the history, character, and ever-shifting purpose of borders and the agents that enforce them, we can better resist the border and equip ourselves against its impact on us all. Resistance to the border is complicated. It often involves rejecting borders, while at the same time trying to improve the immediate realities of people crossing them by seeking to reform or soften the border regime. There is here, in this resistance, what author and academic Natasha King calls a fundamental tension. Sometimes we find ourselves acting within and to an extent validating a system that is harming ourselves and others. This happens when we defend and advocate for people's right to reside or have citizenship, alongside also rejecting the exalted category of citizen. This tension cannot be easily reconciled, which feels apt for the pursuit of human movement and mobility, which is complex and messy. Free movement is so basic and so intrinsic that it could be described as an inevitable part of the human condition. Underneath it all, movement and border crossing is so expected as to be banal, but nonetheless, our stories of moving and journeying are rich and wondrous in their immense variety and multiple dimensions. Much like the narratives of many migrant communities, my family's history of border crossing is archived primarily in the memories of elders, occasionally spoken as oral histories, which drop like rare jewels from wise mouths at the dinner table. My paternal grandparents came from Jamaica to the UK in the 1950s as citizens of Britain. They are part of what is termed the Windrush generation, named after the HMT Empire Windrush, an ex-Nazi ship acquired as a prize of war by Britain, which was chartered from the Caribbean to England in 1948. Many more ships followed the Empire Windrush. This generation of border crossers were invited, so the story goes, to help rebuild Britain after the destruction of World War II. This movement to Britain retraced a trail paved with blood, capital, and labour. This homecoming to the mother country was inextricably linked to Jamaica's position as a colony of the British Empire. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain played a leading role in trafficking and enslaving African people, bringing them to countries like Jamaica to labour on plantations and grow and harvest crops like tobacco and later sugarcane. The profits which were extracted from slave labour were invested back in Britain through the construction of banks, factories, and canals, which helped industrialisation to flourish. Meanwhile, back in Jamaica, in the decades and centuries following the abolition of legal slavery, freed Jamaicans subsisted in conditions of poverty, and the country faced slow economic growth and high levels of unemployment and state debt. Fast forward 100 or so years to 1952, and my grandfather purchases a one-way ticket to England, hoping to study and secure a better future for his family. He waves goodbye to relatives and loved ones in Jamaica, including my grandmother, promising to send for her if he manages to find a job. When he does find work drilling holes into hob elements, my grandmother takes the long boat journey to join him, with the talisman of a nutmeg nestled in her pocket to remind her of home and to ward off seasickness. When she arrives in England in the middle of a frosty winter, she notices the leafless trees and wonders why all the trees are dead. This migration route, so steeped in history, was taken by almost 500,000 Caribbean people between 1948 and 1970, curious to see what Britain was like and seeking to build lives for themselves and their families. However, the hostile border between Britain and the Caribbean was firmly reasserted in the 1971 Immigration Act, and the expansion of this border continues to the present day. In 2018, the Windrush scandal exposed that British Caribbean elders had been subjected to targeted immigration enforcement by the UK Home Office as part of government attempts to meet net immigration goals. This is only one example. Similar relationships of exploitation, where migrant communities are dismissed once they have served their economic purpose, exist between the UK and countries all over the world. The history of physical border demarcation is elite, colonial, and rooted in capitalism. Borders have always been closely linked to securing property and territory and shoring up wealth. From the Great Wall of China to Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, early borders around cities and regions were built to preserve empires and keep out invaders. More recent constructions, such as the US-Mexico border wall, the apartheid wall in occupied Palestine, and the mile-long wall in Calais in northern France, which fortifies the entrance to the Channel Tunnel, demonstrate how borders are erected in attempts to preserve ideologies, prevent free movement, and oppress populations. Around 70 physical border walls now exist globally. This figure rapidly increased after the end of World War II, a point at which only 7 border walls had been constructed. The building of border walls also intensified after 9/11, including at the US-Mexico border, which was fortified by measures pushed through by George W. Bush's administration and then developed further under Barack Obama's presidency. The US-Mexico wall continues to be leveraged by politicians of all stripes to symbolize protection of American citizens from dangerous outsiders. Immigration enforcement was ramped up alongside this renewed wall building fervor. Obama's administration deported more people than the collective sum of deportations carried out by all other US presidents in the 20th century. As I illustrate in chapter 4, politicians and lawmakers' dedication to borders and immigration controls is guided and intensified by the sentiments churned out by national and international media outlets. The strong symbolism of borders is prime fodder for the screaming headlines of the 24-hour news cycle. Looming stone and steel fortifications provoke quasi-biblical and mythological connotations. States encourage and respond to this sentiment with enthusiasm. Throughout this book, I outline some of the laws and policies that have built up Britain's current border regime. Cumulatively, they demonstrate that the state will never meaningfully legislate for open, relaxed, or no borders, because to do so would be to blur the edges of its own power. Work to amend immigration laws and policies is important insofar as it improves people's lives in the here and now. But we must carefully consider the ways in which reforming an inherently abusive border regime makes it harder to destroy altogether. Just as air inside a balloon would never advocate for bursting the skin that holds it, states as we know them will never support steps towards their own eradication.
I just realised I was muted, but thanks so much, Leah. That was amazing. Yeah, I love your book so much. I feel like it's super accessible. Got all the info in there. I just like love the way you like interwove some of like personal stories, and like I just think your writing is like amazing. So great.
Thanks.
Oh, you know, you're great. So next, I think if Miranda's able to do so, we're just going to show like it's like a 2.5 minute film that was filmed at some demos outside of outside the Home Office that were that were held in solidarity with women who were hunger striking inside of Yarlswood. You'll see there's particularly in the film is the All African Women's Group, who we work quite closely with, the abolition campaign, abolish detention campaign, some of whom I think are in the meeting, which is great. Yeah, do you want to play?
Freedom! All your racist, sexist borders, we don't need them! Need them! We want freedom! We want freedom! Freedom! All your racist, sexist borders, we don't need them! Need them! On the 21st of February 2018, the Yarlswood detainees began a hunger strike, in which approximately 120 people took part in a protest against some of the more offensive practices of the Home Office, which include, but are by no means limited to, the following. If liberty is to be taken, let it be taken not lightly and by a qualified judge in a court of law. The majority of detainees are not detained by a judge. Second point, the UK is the only country in the EU with no time limit on detention, and people are detained indefinitely pending the Home Office's incompetent and untimely manner in handling cases. We believe that the Home Office, is overwhelmed, not fit for purpose, and operates in a rogue manner.
I'm from Black Women's Rape Action Project, and together with All African Women's Group and Women Against Rape, we've been supporting women who've gone on hunger strike in Yarlswood since 2005. That was the first major hunger strike. Now this is the 5th, and I have to tell you that each one has had an increase, almost like an exponential success. That this policy of detention is deliberate to frustrate women's rights to get their right to be here.
Yes.
All African women's groups start with that, the right to be here.
I want to say thank you so much for everybody supporting us and everybody fighting for us, fighting for our liberty today, but we're fighting for your liberty for tomorrow. So thank you very much for all your solidarity.
Shut it down! Shut it down! Shut it down!
That's great. Thanks very much. Just to give you a kind of like an idea of the resistance that has gone on inside and outside of the detention centres, and to the, not just to the detention centres, but also to like the hostile environment entirely. Also, I guess like we're looking a bit at Yarlswood tonight, but also there have, of course, been huge hunger strikes in Harmondsworth, in Collinbrook, in Brook House, and all of the detention centres. So next, I'm going to give a little presentation about the Abolish Detention campaign. I'm really sorry to the people that came to the talk 2 weeks ago, because it is pretty much the same presentation. But yeah, there we go. So I'll just share my screen now. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, yeah, so we are Abolish Detention Hassockfield. We're a grassroots radical group set up in the Northeast. We came into being quite recently, basically, particularly to oppose the plans for this new women's detention centre at Hassockfield in County Durham. I guess for people that don't know, like, the site that it's proposed at is also quite a significant site in terms of the state-induced trauma and abuse that has already happened there. So it's in Medhemsley, which, yeah, so in 1961 until 1988, it was Medhemsley Detention Centre for Young Men. So that was like 16 to 21-year-old men. And then, oh, it doesn't have the year, but basically during, like, then sometime after that, I don't remember the year. Anyways, following the closure of the space of this detention centre, Operation Seabrook happened, which was a report which reported, yeah, nearly 2,000 reports of sexual and physical abuse towards the young men that were detained in that centre. And so following that report, 4 individual officers were prosecuted, but there have been no kind of, the state has never taken responsibility for the fact that actually it knew that people were being abused within the centre. And so the the survivors of the original Medhemsley Detention Centre are still awaiting justice. I've got here a little quote from a newspaper from one of them that says, "Bulldoze it, flatten it, but turn it into a nice big field with a memorial to the lads who have suffered, and leave it at that." The government have still not done that. So it was closed for a while, and then in 1995 it reopened again as Hassockfield Secure Training Centre, again for young boys, this time actually minors, so 12 to 17-year-olds, like a what are they called? Like, I don't think there were secure schools, I can't remember exactly, like Young Offenders Institute, I suppose. And then in 2004, the youngest person to ever die in British penal prison system hung himself at the age of 14. So this is the site that they are now planning to turn into a women's detention centre. So yeah, March this year, the Ministry of Justice and the local Tory MP, Richard Holden, announced that, unlike the previous Labour predecessor had said that it would be for social housing, I think actually the general public still weren't really into that. But anyways, they announced, instead of anything that might be a kind of space of healing or social justice, etc., it was now going to be turned into a migrant detention centre for women. And their proposals is that it will hold 85 women indefinitely. As we know, detention in the UK is indefinite, awaiting deportation. But as I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, like, that can run up to years and years and years. So yeah, we found recently that the centre will be run by a multinational private corporation called Mighty, who also run some other detention centres, and it will be run for profit. So yeah, the context, like Leah talked about so brilliantly, is kind of, you know, the increasingly hostile environment, the criminalisation of migration, this kind of environment that we live in. Yeah, and so there's various campaigns that are all coming together and working together to oppose this detention centre. Women for Refugee Women have a petition, and they also have a Write to Your MP campaign. The Durham's People Assembly, who are campaigning mostly locally, like in concert in County Durham. They held a demo there a couple of weeks ago. And the No to Hassockfield campaign have activated some legal challenges to try and legally challenge the opening of the centre. I guess it's worth noting that because it was already a place of incarceration, there isn't the same sort of like procedures in terms of planning. Like they don't have to do the same level of consultation that they might do if they were opening a new prison or a new detention centre. So the time frame is quite soon. They're talking about opening it by September. So it's great that everybody is here to stop it. But yeah. So we are the Abolish Detention Hassockfield campaign. Yeah, so I guess we're like a group of local concerned and individuals and organisations, a mixture of people with lived experience of detention and the hostile environment and those who stand in solidarity. We are non-partisan, so we're not associated with any political party or rooting for you to vote today or anything like that. The aim is to stop the detention centre opening and hopefully close all detention centres and ultimately live in a beautiful, no borders, capitalist free world. That's just my idea. Yeah, so we've been doing various things. So taking some actions to pressurise contractors to kind of pull out of the building of it, contacting local unions to pass motions to oppose it, working with youth groups, having like online actions and conversations and talks like this one. Yeah, trying to centre the voices of those with lived experience of detention and standing in solidarity with survivors, and raising awareness about the brutality of immigration detention. And I guess kind of the need for a more sort of abolitionist perspective, which maybe we'll talk about in terms of like, we're not here for a 28-day time limit. Like we wholeheartedly believe that detention needs to stop entirely. Yeah. Okay, so why abolition? Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot. Yeah, so abolition is a kind of political vision, as Leah sort of started to outline, against imprisonment and in policing, but also I guess it has a sort of like optimistic element in terms of like that we can imagine more community-based solutions to the problems in our communities. Not that migration is a problem, but you know, like harms and things that happen within our communities, we can come together in a way that doesn't involve incarcerating people or criminalizing people to solve those situations. We recognize that, as Leah said, like the borders are violent, detention is deadly. People, like lots of people have died in detention centers. It's based on institutional abuse. It's systematically racist, sexist, classist, and the levels of self-harm are, yeah, absolutely skyrocketed. And as hopefully we'll talk about as well, is that the immigration system, the growth in it and all of that is based upon profit and racism, and not really based on any sort of care or, yeah. Okay. So this is just a couple of like images from some actions that have been taken recently in and around the country, both online and on a beach, as you can see. Yeah, so we're really hoping to kind of build the campaign and keep going. And I think hopefully there's a lot of momentum for that. So this is our social medias, etc. Well, I'll put this back up again at the end of the talk so people have a bit of a chance. Our next kind of general meeting is on Sunday, the 16th of May, and it would be really great to get as many new people there as possible. Like as always with anything, if you need internet data or any other way that will be helpful for you to access the campaign, then just let us know, send us an email or Facebook, etc. And we're also going to do another workshop around the campaign to really like look at strategies of what actions we can all take together, both in our local communities and as a campaign. And that's on Tuesday, May the 18th. So that is it from me for now. Oh no, what do I need to do? I need to stop sharing. No. Okay.
Well, I'll share the second video now.
Yes, please, that would be great. Thank you.
This is from Yarlswood.
Just imagine how it feels being jailed for no offense, for just claiming asylum.
People need to know about this place. People don't know about the things that go on in there. People need to know. There's abuse going on in here that's really disgusting. I mean, they've had sexual abuse, rape, the guards are kind of preying on women, and Yarlswood's become a bit of a symbol for the immigration system. Okay. What are we doing out here? We're protesting. We're going to stop it. We're going to shut it down.
Detention centers are essentially private prisons, so they're being run by corporations for profit, and people are being put there and held there in insane conditions. They're being abused, they're being held away from their families.
It's a place where they bring women who are seeking asylum. They're locked up before they're given any status in the country. So this is where they're kept till that point, if, and that's a big if they get any status at all.
How long can we be kept?
Well, it's indefinitely.
Totally.
It's in an indefinite stay. You can never know where you could be there. You could be there a day, or you could be there forever.
If you don't get to integrate with society, you can feel really isolated and feel like no one knows that you're here. I think this is an opportunity for us to be like, we know you're there, we're trying.
It's not a good way of dealing with the situation of detaining people who are not criminals in prison circumstances. And we are the only country in Europe to have unlimited detention.
Like prison, it's prison. If you put bars behind me or in front of me, that means you're blocking me from my freedom. I need to do something.
And what's the crime?
Moving. Because I'm a migrant, I'm moving from one place to another.
And there are other factors that lead us to be a refugee. No one wants to be a refugee.
I think most people just don't even know that this exists. So I think it's really the job of the media to pick up on stuff like this, because no big news media ever reports these protests. So it's just we're all here and nobody notices that we're here. People are talking about this, but the media aren't picking up on it.
Shut it down! Shut it down! Shut it down!
Thanks, Miranda. I guess, yeah, that was just to sort of give you, for those that haven't been on those protests or whatever, like kind of the idea around the resistance that has happened. Like, I'm sure you saw the women that were inside the detention centre and outside these detention centres. And there is a long history, as we saw from the first video, of resisting immigration detention centres. And that is what we are going to keep doing. So now we'll just do a little Q&A, a little discussion with Leah, and then we'll open out to the Q&A. A bit ahead of time, so I guess maybe we'll start the Q&A 8. There's quite a lot of people here, and I think there's a few people with lived experience, and so we'd really like to kind of ensure that people have the time to speak if they'd like to. But yeah, just to get a bit more kind of background, I guess, like, Leah, in your book, like you've written like we've written like a whole chapter on detention, and like you said in your intro, you know, that the borders are inherently violent, and I guess like the detention system seems like a real kind of exemplifier of the violence of the British border regime. You also talked about the borders there to shore up wealth and about capitalism, and I guess like we know that this detention centre, which won't happen in County Durham, is to be run by Mighty. And I just wondered if you would be able to talk a bit about that kind of link between like private profit and immigration detention and the borders and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the point of detention being for profit, you know, we know that profit goes into the pockets of the shareholders of those private companies. It doesn't go to like, you know, working class people, even people that are working in the centres, right? And absolutely, detention and deportation are these huge kind of money-making schemes effectively. And I think we've really seen how, as deportations have increased in the past decades, so to have the profits that are being made by those private companies that are outsourced to carry them out. There's that current £525 million contract to provide guards to escort people who are being deported, which is held by Mighty. There's other companies making profits off detention, which includes the airlines that carry out deportations, such as British Airways, EasyJet, Qatar Airways, and Turkish Airlines. And then there were some stats that were compiled by The Guardian in 2019, which revealed that in a 3-month period, just like a sample 3-month period they chose, the Home Office spent £250,000 on deportation flights that never actually left the runway. And a Freedom of Information Act request by No Deportations in March this year also revealed that the Home Office spends like £13,000 more than that on a single deportation. So it's just so evident that, much like immigration detention, the charter flights, which are very much linked to that process of detaining people with the intention of removing them, deporting them from the country, these are aspects of the border that are both incredibly costly and don't actually kind of meet the stated aim of why the government says they're doing them. And we can kind of deduce from that, I guess, that there's like another agenda at play, which is this profit-making motive and agenda that we see playing out, I think.
Yeah, totally. I think it's really good that you talk about, like, I guess that the money is not going into the local community, because particularly in this situation, like the local Tory MP, Richard Holden, is kind of really saying like, oh, there's going to be so many jobs and it's going to be making loads of money for the community. But actually, like you've really said, like that's not the case, right?
Yeah, I mean, I read that statement about Hassockfield bringing jobs to local people and money to the local economy, and I think it's very much classic like divide and rule tactics, playing into the politics of fear and division. It's exploiting the fact that over a decade of austerity and public funding cuts has of course hit working class people the hardest, and like the suggestion that the solution to that is to make money and jobs from incarcerating other ostensibly working class people, because we know that people targeted for detention are overwhelmingly people of colour, migrant communities, obviously, working class people who've sought asylum. It's just really kind of sickening rhetoric that politicians have like capitalised on for centuries, really, this kind of fear and divide and rule approach. And people have a very well-founded fear and lived experience of these things like unemployment and struggling to make ends meet. But it's not because there weren't detention centres, providing jobs to solve that problem. It's because of the government's own policies, and they've used that very much to like drive wedges in society.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Like just on the weekend, obviously it was May Day, and so we like took kind of online and physical action to sort of say that like migrants don't drive down wages, it's the boss. Pays less. Capitalism chooses to make profit out of people, and it will exploit whoever it can to do so. I guess just I kind of wondered if we could talk a bit about, so obviously at the Hassockfield site specifically really like exemplifies the kind of link between like prison and detention, and the way that these things really actually work in a sort of kind of secular motion. And obviously you also kind of talked a little bit about the criminal legal system, because there is no justice in it at the very beginning. And I wondered if you just were able to kind of draw out some of those nuances.
Yeah, I think for me, prisons and detention is very much linked, because immigration detention centres I see them as like absolutely part of the prison industrial complex, by which I mean, the web of institutions and laws and policies that include police, prisons, probation, surveillance, tagging, young offender institutions. All of that is this kind of thick web that sometimes gets referred to as the prison industrial complex. And I think the work of prison abolition is about looking at all of these institutions and as you were saying earlier, Sarah, kind of recognizing that they don't solve social and economic issues. It's like what Angela Davis says, you know, prisons disappear human beings, they don't disappear the problems that they kind of claim to solve. And I think detention centres are related to this issue because they serve, very similarly to prisons, a political and a monetary purpose. As we've said, you know, they're profit-making ventures for private companies. I think all of the detention centres in the UK but one are run by these private companies. And they also suit government agendas. So, you know, politicians can point to detention centres and say, oh, look, we're being really like tough on immigration. I think with detention centres, it's even less evident that they're like solving any social issues because, as you also said, you know, migration isn't a social problem. It's very much like the government response to migration that causes the issues, in the context of like centuries of racism and legislative hostility to people coming to this country. Yeah, and I think in terms of like the other way that this connects to prison abolition, I think in the like popular imagination, immigration detention sits at like the coming together of two ideas, which is like the migrant and the prison. And in the public imagination, you know, prisons need to exist and they keep us safe, and people locked up inside them are dangerous or a threat, like allegedly. And then on top of that, you know, over a decade of hostile environment rhetoric and many more racist decades and centuries, and yeah, running back to colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, the idea that the migrant is something that's been intensively vilified in the public imagination. So a prison for migrants becomes this like perfect concoction for, you know, a right-wing and or like hostile environment loving audience. And this idea that some people deserve to be in the UK and some don't is such a rigid concept to try and dismantle. But yeah, I'm very heartened that campaigns like Abolish Detention, Hassockfield are doing that important work, because I think they are such like, yeah, concrete fossified ideas. The idea of prisons being needed and migrants being something specific. Yeah, the work of prison abolition is definitely connected to the abolition of the border in that sense as well.
Yeah, totally. And I guess like the kind of Hassockfield thing, in a way, it's like easier to sort of draw those parallels in terms of like, you know, 20 years of abuse towards like young British men, and now a site which will be abusive towards non-British women, and actually kind of saying like these are both the prison and the detention system are essentially spaces of state-sanctioned abuse.
Yeah,
sort of continue, like that's a continuation.
Definitely.
And I guess, sorry.
No, yeah, just agreeing.
Like, I guess also just in terms of, I think you wrote about it in the book, you know, the sort of like the criminalization of migration and how that has kind of really resulted in this situation where we sort of feel like it's kind of considered okay to have a prison for migrants. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything more you wanted to kind of draw out on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really pertinent in light of like recent developments around like the new plan for immigration, right? Kind of Priti Patel's idea that you're going to have like 2 tiers of people seeking asylum, and if you come on like a informal route, which could include trafficking, you're going to be treated in a certain way, and if you come in a formal route, you'll get different things. I think it's this work of, but very much by the government, of creating like a strata of migrant, which can include like certain groups of people that are more sympathetic in the public imagination, whether it's like asylum seekers or LGBT asylum seekers or women or children or all of those things. And then, you know, you get migrants who are incredibly wealthy who come to the UK to kind of buy property, and that's seen as like a really good thing. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you get people who've been like locked up in prison, who've kind of done time and done sentences. And then it's somehow seen as like okay that those people would be deported or transferred to an immigration detention centre at the end of their sentence. So I think, yeah, that criminalisation is definitely about like continuing to reduce the category of migrant that is seen as like acceptable and okay, and expanding the categories that are going to be criminalized, going to be penalized for moving, and aren't going to receive any kind of public sympathy for crossing borders.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. I guess that kind of like ongoing tension of who is deserving and who isn't, which like, the thing we have with kind of people that have been criminalized, regardless of what your nationality is, you know, you suddenly become undeserving of anything because you happen to be poor and therefore you had to break laws or whatever. You talked about it as well, like I realized I haven't got loads of time, but there's a couple more things. I guess you sort of talked about like the tension between reform and abolition and how like we kind of how to navigate that, and I thought that was like really interesting. Yeah, I guess the 28-day time limit is a really perfect example of that, but actually what is clearly would be a harmful reform. I don't know if there's anything else you would like to bring out on that.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, I think the thing with the tension is that it's you just constantly move back and forth and you don't ever really reach like a perfect answer for like what the way ahead is. It's always going to be like a multiplicity of tactics. And yeah, I agree with you, the idea of like a time limit, you know, like on the face of it as a short-term solution, putting a time limit on detention would kind of materially improve the lives of, you know, the 25,000 people who are currently detained each year. But in reality, it would probably mean like a larger amount of people being detained for a shorter time. So it's that weighing up of like, would that, aside from it being like a reformist approach that wouldn't necessarily contribute to like abolition, like would that be an improvement, or would it just be like a shape shifting, which would actually make, you know, the whole thing harder to abolish because it would make the shapes of, you know, a detention looking more humane, I guess, in some respect. I do think about, you know, the fact that a time limit on detention has been a demand that is often made kind of on hunger strikes and from people inside detention, which is why, you know, of course, we can't dismiss it as like my opinion is that we can't dismiss it as like a demand, because our movement is and should be very much led by people at the sharp edge of the border regime. And maybe there's a space for like thinking about strategies that would like run alongside that demand that would, I don't know, kind of help to mitigate the reformist nature of it. Like a time limit on detention wouldn't improve any of the conditions for people in detention, whether you're in there for 1 day or like 1 year, you know. So we can continue to like amplify and push forward around conditions in detention, access to healthcare, the fact that people can't speak to their lawyers and can't access the internet. I'm interested in thinking about whether these are things that can be amplified more if a time limit did come into place. It's that thing that Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, like fighting to win. Like if there was like a win, depending on whether you see a time limit as a win or not, what would be the next step, and are we prepared for like how we would ensure that didn't make abolition harder, like as much as possible. That's a bit of a non-answer, but yeah, it's a tension with no kind of perfect solution, I think.
No, totally. I think it's like really important, the point that you made, that is a thing that a lot of people in detention say, and totally, like, you know, I think you quote it in your book, but it's, you know, quite a well-known quote in terms of like, when you're in prison, you count down the days, and when you're in detention, you count them up. And that is, you know, I guess like considering that it is the only country in Europe that has indefinite detention, that's a real like, well, problem, right? I'm gonna ask you one more question, but I just wanted to reflect on that a little bit. I guess the other thing that I think is about the potential for deportations to be pushed through much quicker if there's only a 28-day time limit that people can be detained. So I guess like which you've done already, is like also having like the kind of ending deportations to be is such an integral part of the kind of campaign against detention, like, and it has to be, in terms of like, obviously that's such a fear that you'll be deported and you don't know when that's going to happen, and etc. Yeah, there's quite a lot of people here, so it'd be good to kind of hear from other people, but I just I guess I just wanted to ask you a bit, like, so you obviously you kind of interwove like your own stories and around migration. I also have my own family stories of migration. I just really liked how you did that, and how like yeah, just the kind of like intrinsic value that you gave to those stories, and like how, I guess, how or you think that they can be used to kind of like shape the vision of the future, like an abolitionist future coming from people's stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said before, like the future that we want collectively, and the way that we're going to get there, is like very much going to be steered by people who have experienced the sharp edge of the border regime, because, you know, they have the expertise and the knowledge and the strategies for how we're going to like dismantle this thing. I think the process of like talking to my family whilst writing this book, and especially speaking to my grandfather, who kind of, as I said in the beginning, like came over in that Windrush era on those early ships, it really made me think about like just the complexity of that process, and what it does to you and how you relate to it, like without like throwing my granddad under the bus, like I'm pretty sure he voted for Brexit, like I'm pretty sure he, you know, he has quite conservative political views. It's not that border crossing, like necessarily lots of people in this meeting will have the opposite experience, in that border crossing absolutely is like a politicizing activity and like an act of resistance and like a radical act. But for some people, I suppose, they don't conceptualize it as thus. And there are other kind of survival strategies that come into play when you cross borders, that might involve like very much adopting, you know, some of the racism of the country that you're coming into, and are very much pulling up of the ladder underneath you, which isn't a very like stirring and motivating thought to think about, but I think it really made me think a bit harder about like the strategies we need to employ, and how, if we're going to bring everyone along with us on this journey, there's going to be a real range of different experiences and responses to border crossing, and yeah, it's gonna involve a range of tactics and tools to kind of bring us all together, I think.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Priti Patel is the kind of like quintessential pulling up the drawbridge, right? But totally, like, I think like there's a danger of sort of romanticizing a certain experience or situation or whatever, and that like that's really like illustrates that, and like also just that people aren't all the same, right? And that's kind of so I guess, yeah, we've got about half an hour left, and there's like, I don't know how many people, there's loads of people in here, nearly 40 people, so I don't know if people, so we plan to do a Q&A, but I guess like if people who have lived experiences of detention or the hostile environment would like to speak first, then that would be great. And also if people have questions, either you can pop them in the chat, I think, is that what we're doing, Miranda?
Yeah, or you can raise your hand or just start speaking.
Yeah,
whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I guess like the floor is kind of open for people. Yeah, if people have comments or things they'd like to share or questions, then yeah, either raise your hand or just jump in.
Sarah has a raised hand. If you'd like to unmute yourself and go for it.
Sorry, I didn't realize I'd be called on. I just wanted to pick up, thank Leah for her presentation. I just wanted to add a couple of things. I think that in terms of romanticizing, for example, people that climb Mount Kilimanjaro, or they're seen as heroic, but people that cross 5 mountain ranges and the sea to get here are considered, worthless. And I think it's like what value we put on human life. And the fact is that people are fleeing from, war caused by countries in the north, by Britain and the US, climate devastation, and we have every right to be here. We're descendants of you, and we're descendants of people that worked for 500 years. The wealth here belongs to us and white working class people. So I think it's not romanticizing, but just looking at what is the reality. We have paid a high price already before we even come here. And so when we come, we're not coming as beggars, although that's how we're often treated as Black and immigrant people, but we have every right to be here. And I just wanted to say, in relation to women are often not seen as real immigrants or asylum seekers. And they don't see, for example, rape is not considered, officially a form of torture. They don't see the children that have been left behind, and some of the worst suffering is mothers who are here worrying and trying to care for their children back at home when they've had to flee and leave those children behind. That is torture. And then we're living for years and years on, whatever, shoestring, 36 pounds a week or whatever they're giving, and some women with no money at all. So I think the issue of the destitution, the fact that we have a right to be here, that should be in every time we speak, we have to underline that. We have every right to be here. The wealth, you look around at the wealth, that wealth was built by our ancestors, the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors. And still today, they're robbing Africa every day. So I just wanted to add in those points, and thank you for organizing this meeting, because I think it's the more we discuss it, the more we can go forward together. There was one other thing. I think with the 28 days, I think we have to look at where the movement is at, and where the movement is at is we could shut down detention. It's possible. And so the people who are calling for 28 days, they have their own agenda. They're not listening to what asylum seekers are saying or where the movement is at. So I think that's part of the judgment we make. Where are we at as a movement? What can we demand and what can we win? And we're in a position where we can close detention, but that has to be the absolute priority, it seems to me. Thank you.
Do you want to respond, or Rosa also has her hand up?
Yeah, I might jump in with a quick reflection. Thank you so much for that. Sarah, your question of what value do we put on human life, it made me think about, I'm not so much worried about the value that I'm making a broad assumption about the people in this conversation, the value that we put on human life. It's the value that the kind of capitalist structures put on human life. And we see that very much in the way that who visas are granted to and how much money people have to pay and the different hoops people have to jump through. And if you have a certain amount of money in your bank account, it's a lot easier to come to this country. I think that value judgment is very plain with the border regime. We can see what the state sees as important and enough for someone to come to this country. And I'm really glad that you raised the point about women in destitution. In my day job, I work for an advice centre for migrant families who are destitute and have no recourse to public funds. And we've very much seen how, particularly throughout the pandemic, so many women are being kind of pushed to breaking point, to the kind of poverty line, because of the no recourse to public funds condition, which is very much part of the border regime, and very linked to austerity and the government agenda of, as you say, giving people absolutely peanuts to live on. So yeah, I'm really glad you raised that, and thank you for sharing.
Rosa, would you like to, got your hand up as well?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for those who've spoken so far. I think there's been some really important points made, and the work of you, Leah, and the way that you've brought all of these thoughts together. I suppose I have two questions. One is that, Leah, towards the end of that chapter, you talk about this idea that, you know, states will never dissolve themselves because, of course, it, you know, blurs their power. And so in terms of trying to advocate for a borderless society, I'm just kind of wondering what the thoughts are around how do we do that then? You know, like what are the mechanisms by which we achieve that, if that's the aim? And I suppose, and maybe linked to that is another reflection around this question about the 28 days, because I don't think it's just about the 28 days. I think that what I'm wondering, and I saw that someone else put a comment in the chat saying, I think it was Ali, saying that they'd never met anyone in detention who didn't advocate for that time limit to be applied. And I can imagine that I'm just imagining that if I was in detention myself, that of course I would want there not to be detention, but while I'm in that reality, I would prefer to know that there was an end in sight. So I'm just kind of wondering around that thing of course, while the goal is, you know, the big goal, but when the way of actually improving conditions. And I don't think it has to be a choice of one over the other. I do think that there can be ways, and I think in so many different battles that are being fought that can be the case, that there needs to be, yes, a dedication to the big vision, but we know that can take a long time to achieve, and that some of it is, you know, like you've said, Leah, completely contrary to, you know, what the powers want. And so therefore it's a big fight. And therefore, you know, how do we in the meantime deal with the reality and deal with the reality that people are experiencing now? You know, they can't wait 5 years for that thing to change, or 10 years, or however long it's going to take. They're experiencing what they are now. So I guess I'm just kind of wondering how we can have the discussion that has that nuance without it feeling like it has to be either or, and thinking of the people who are experiencing those things now and what matters to them. So I'm kind of really also curious to hear, like, what do people in detention or who've experienced detention, what do they want us to do? What do they want us to do in terms of Hassockfield, but also more generally, what, you know, how can we be guided by that?
Sarah, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I can do.
Yeah.
Sorry, I guess.
I think you can. I mean, I know that a lot of you are organizers, and so and involved in the movement, and so we're doing both. We work with. I mean, we work with the All Africa Women's Group. I guess about maybe it's a network of about 100 women, and about 2/3 have been detained. Every single woman says even at one day, even an hour is too long. You know, they're victims of violence, have committed no crime, and have no business being detained at all. So on the one hand, we fight for, you know, better conditions inside healthcare, but we also fight to shut down at the same time, and you can do both. The problem with the 28 days is that it was coming from very highly funded, I don't know how you call it, prominent organizations who are not the ones in detention. You know, they're not going to be locked up for those 28 days. And I think once you've been in detention, you have a very different view of what that's like to be locked, have your liberty taken, and live in fear and under threat of guards for 28 days is outrageous. So I think where is the demand coming from? But that demand, I've never heard from the women in our network. They say even an hour is too long. And I think that I would just mention, you know, the time of when the stand said 15, did their action and got arrested and went to court, the movement really went up because people saw, look, these young white middle class people are putting their lives on the line. And there was a big outcry against the 28 days because people said, look, this is not the time to be calling for 28 days. The movement's coming up. People are out there going for it. And luckily those people seemed to have gone quiet on that demand, but it was a bad demand. And sometimes we have to say to people, look, that is not a good demand. You have to, and how is that affecting other people if you're not the person on the front line? Anyway, the only other thing about detention is it's something against all of us because they use detention to tell us that some people can be brutalized, can be locked up, can be destroyed. And that poisons the whole of the society. And so that's another reason we have to be absolutely against it because it's a danger to all of us.
Thanks. I see Ali has a raised hand, unless Leah or Sarah wants to respond.
Should I go?
Yeah, go for it.
I was just gonna, because yeah, I just mentioned about the 28 days. It is one of those things. None of us wants that to be a compromised position, and I do agree that now is a time, like, they haven't put the new detention center up yet. Let's not them put anyone in there for one day, for one night. But just to put the other point of view, a friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, who I met when I was visiting in detention, who nearly died in detention, who was on hunger strike, also said, some people have said to me that they won't support 28 days, which is different from calling for it. And she said, that makes me feel like they don't care that I've been here for 10 months because it would help me because I wouldn't be here now. So it's just how we say things, because people, I went to a women's drop-in twice a week, and I also visited people individually. And because some of the groups were saying that they didn't support 28 days as opposed to we don't call for it, the women thought that they weren't prepared to make any compromises that would help the individual women, if you see what I mean. It was confusing to them why people wouldn't want them to be in there less time, even though they knew they were saying, well, they want all or nothing, but anything better would be good for me. So I don't think we should put it as a demand. I'm not saying that. It's the way we word things and the way that we, like we're saying, we want better healthcare services for people who are in detention doesn't mean that they should be in detention. And it's a really complicated issue because there is those things. Will it fast track detention? Will it mean more to people being faster? But I do recall some people being really confused about it, people who had been in detention a number of months. And that's why it resonates with me that to talk to people more, people who have been like long-term detained and also repeatedly detained. I met someone who was detained 5 times. So yeah, also would it be something like, could they be released and then re-detained, in which case it was pointless? And how do we do everything? I know we can't do everything, but I really like, how can we improve the situation for people who may be in detention and stop people who are at risk of detention going in detention and end detention? And sometimes you need different groups to do different things, if you see what I mean. Sorry, that was a bit waffly.
Can I just come back quickly, Ali? It's just, I think that's what we're saying. We have to do, we work on every level. I mean, we're part of GWAD, which is like a network of groups at our center, Global Women Against Deportation. So we use a self-help guide. We have a phone line where we're able to talk to women. We send the guide in. There are, at the moment, all the meetings are on Zoom, but we have calls where women can call in, and it's like a self-help group. Women can discuss their case. And so once women are in that context, they're definitely not going to, once you see the possibility of getting out, you're not going to go for the 28 days. And the other thing about the 28 days, the first thing I heard, where I heard about it first was from Liberty and also from some people high up in the Labour Party. And they were just making their own plans. And they literally said to us things like, well, we can't we can't go to Tories and say close detention. That's all we can get. And we say, but look, are you judging what you do by what the Tories tell you? And that is the problem. Where did the demand come from?
Yeah. And I think now, to be fair, I think we've got more chance of ending detention than getting 28 days in a weird way. So from the time I was talking about, which was, you know, a few years ago to now that there aren't women in Yardswood and stopping them from doing anything is a better bet. So I'm with you on that. I just wanted to put that forward of the confusion. I don't, that some of the people that I was visiting and how we explain things being really important as well as what we're doing.
That sort of links into an anonymous question we've received, which I'll read out in case, unless there's someone who would like to speak. I'll read out this question that says, do you have any advice about the best ways to start these conversations about borders, detention and the hostile environment with those around us?
I think just a quick answer, I guess, is like thinking about, it's such a case by case question, right? Because depending on who you're talking to, you might take a different approach. Kind of like slightly linking to one of Rosa's questions around like, how do we chip away at the border? There's so many different campaigns and angles that we can take, you know, whether it's the right to rent campaign, or ending the right to rent legislation, which is forcing people to kind of have their documents checked if they're trying to rent a property. You know, the people involved, the key stakeholders, if you will, involved in that process are going to be like landlords, gross, but also, you know, estate agents. Like there's lots of people working in different professions that are directly involved in that particular like aspect of the border that have been turned into de facto border guards by you know, 2 successive immigration acts. So if you were talking to somebody who worked in that sector, maybe that would be a thing to say, oh, you know, this new part of your new job, like that's actually because of, you know, everyday borders that have come into play. Or if it's somebody who's working in healthcare, we know there's new kind of checks and charges for healthcare, particularly maternity care, parental care for people who've given birth. So if you're talking to someone who works in that sector, maybe that would be the avenue that you would go down, and you could send them some links to campaigns that show, you know, people who are doing your job or living in your area or whatever the kind of point of relevance is, are resisting. Here's how they're doing it, and here's how you can kind of be a part of that very everyday resistance. I think often when we talk about border abolition, it feels like a big, like massive pie in the sky fantasy idea, and it is a fantasy in a good way. It's a vision, but it also has like lots of very small practical steps that everybody can take on the route. Like if you work in an airline, are you working on a plane? You know, what do you know what you can do if you see a deportation happening and how you can be involved? I think, yeah, there's lots of little calls to action that you could begin to share with relevant people.
Can I come in as well? Sorry. I guess just like in terms of the specific, obviously it's quite, like Leah said, it's hard to know about like the specifics because without context, but I guess in terms of the Hassockfield situation, I feel like the fact that it was already a prison that like abused so many people and then is going to be a detention centre which is going to really be abusive of women is such a clear linkage of like actually like there is working class solidarity between those things. And also like, I guess, like for me, I always, to be totally honest, I tend to bring things back to capitalism and the Tories and Labour sometimes, but like I guess also like we were kind of talking about like about the jobs thing and the profit making and the money and like who gets the money, like it's not us. And I guess the kind of, like Leah said, you know, the divide and rule, like is the reason that you're broke because there's a Lithuanian family next door? Like no, they're also broke. you know, like they don't live in Buckingham Palace, or they don't live in the Canary Islands, or wherever it is, offshored loads of money. And I think, like, for me, that's the kind of thing of like trying to draw, because that's the reality, right? Like, is that actually we're all working class people. Some people have papers, some people don't, but ultimately that's the you know, I guess the kind of humanity of the situation. Sorry, stop now.
And a final point, we can also kind of, we're not like reinventing the wheel, we can point to like the long history of like solidarity, like the working class is the most like diverse social class, for want of like a better word, and there's a long history of like, yeah, white working class people standing shoulder to shoulder with us in struggle, whether it's for like workers' rights or yeah, people being paid £1 an hour in immigration detention. That is like a vibrant part of our history. So we're not talking about doing something new, we're talking about like building, expanding, growing our like working class movements of solidarity, which, yeah, we're building on it. We don't have to start from zero.
No one has their hand raised, but we can take a moment if anyone would like to chat, put a question in the chat box, or a comment or reflection, or just speak aloud. Please feel free to go for it.
I'll throw out a question, which isn't really a question, just something that I've been thinking about, that when we've been kind of talking about the time limit, I know that in the movement to kind of end detention, we've spoken about the indefinite nature of immigration detention, and obviously that is one of the kind of most abhorrent aspects of it. And I suppose this is a bit of a clinical question, but I'm always interested to think strategically, like, I wonder what are the other bits of detention that are gonna like provoke the most outrage, and like how can we be amplifying those? Like, I wonder if the fact that like people can't really access the internet and speak to their lawyers, or the fact that detention centers are, you know, on these like shadowy business parks in the middle of nowhere. We rightfully talk a lot about detention being indefinite, and I'd be really interested to know what people think are like maybe unexplored horrors of detention that like maybe we could use as levers to kind of explain to people why it needs to end. Maybe that's a rhetorical question, but if anyone has any thoughts.
I found it really interesting, sorry, just to chip in, there was a dystopian fiction TV show last year or the year before, Years and Years, that had detention as a plot line in the drama. And I thought that was quite interesting in the way that it was probably the most powerful storyline. So I'm personally interested in the way in which kind of different forms of speculative fiction kind of can engage people in imagining how things could be otherwise. And obviously in that case, it was a dystopian scenario, but in a sort of critical dystopian one, you can see pockets of resistance within these dystopian landscapes. And so I thought that was quite powerful, because in a way, repeating all of the kind of horrific violence that happens in detention centers is really important, but at the same time, it's obviously that's quite a lot. So I think it's thinking about those fictional realms as well can be another route that I'm interested in. So Jessica has raised a hand.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering what you think about kind of like the highlighting the harms of the hostile environment policy for anyone. So like I'm here on a tier 2 visa for my work, and even for me, even though like I'm, you know, a very privileged migrant, the hostile environment policy means that, you know, we had to pay a lot of money up front for me and my partner to have healthcare to the NHS, and that there's all kinds of, you know, like bureaucratic hurdles we have to jump over and all of this. So for me, it's like thinking about how, even though obviously I have it easy in a lot of ways, like the hostile environment policy hurts everyone. And yeah, I was just wondering about what you think of that as like an entry point to some of these conversations. Thanks for your talk also.
Does anybody else want to jump in? I'm aware that I've just been chatting a lot.
Rose has raised a hand.
So I'm from a theatre background, and whenever it comes to thinking about protests and campaigning, I'm always interested in thinking about creative ways of doing so, and also how stories presented in a creative way can be impactful. So kind of following in a way what Miranda was saying about, you know, kind of different dramatizations or fictionalized versions of these stories. And my mum wrote a play many years ago about, it's based in Sunderland in the northeast, which was an area where a lot of dispersal was happening. So people were being brought to Sunderland because there was housing available in areas that a lot of the time local people didn't necessarily want to be housed. And so it was being used to house people seeking asylum. And obviously that was moving people into areas that were already very poor, and that had been de-invested in, and were, you know, generations of unemployment, and that process was happening, you know, without really any kind of discussion with local people about where people were coming from and why they were being housed there, and so it again set up that whole divide and rule, you know, like the competition. Oh, why are these people getting houses for free and all of this stuff, you know? And so the way that this play was approached was that the first character that we met was a young woman who had moved from London to the northeast because she and her mum were fleeing a situation of domestic violence. And the children watching, so this was a play that was created for a school audience, and the children watching could immediately kind of get that, like, oh, you know, a young woman and her mum would need to leave because they were unsafe, and they happened to be British citizens. And then it was like the next characters we were meeting were young people who had come from other countries seeking asylum. And so there was that kind of correlation made of, like, you know, someone who the young people could identify with possibly more easily because she spoke the same language as them, or they, you know, she came from the same country. But then they were like, now we kind of understand why you would want to leave your home or have to leave your home to seek safety somewhere else or to be somewhere else, and that people should have a right to do that. So I was just kind of thinking, you know, like there could be similar ways to help people draw those parallels to humanize the people that we're talking about, because so often I think even when it comes to hearing about people's extreme experiences of violence and you know, torture and rape, for so many people that still, as soon as it's with the context of someone who's seeking asylum or a migrant, it somehow suddenly becomes a different issue. You know, it suddenly somehow doesn't become as relatable or as deserving of compassion for people who are already in that divide mindset, you know. So I'm just kind of thinking, are there ways to kind of draw those kinds of parallels that might help people to really feel and understand what the abuse in those centres is like, and why that is so abhorrent and should be stopped.
Thanks. We're kind of actually running out of time a little bit. So I don't know if anyone has a quick thing that they'd like to respond to that. Also to point out, Sarah's put quite a lot of stuff in the chat about the new, the government's immigration bill or plan, which is like the end deadline is tonight to submit comments on it. So if people want to do that, that would be really great. If you just look in the chat, there's a lot of guidance about how to do that, etc. Ali, you've got a quick point, and then I think we'll kind of wrap up.
It was just really quick. I was just, as someone was speaking on what we can do to draw attention and what's different from when I was trying to do that before. And I think people are really noticing how fucked the criminal justice system are, not just people who are in it, but everybody. And we've seen that. And the fact that the Home Office breaks the law like all the time in these cases. And also the fact that the women who have been abused by men are criminalized. So it's often people who've been manipulated through drug use or whatever are portrayed as violent criminals. So I can't really explain my thinking because we haven't got long. But in terms of the publicity and the getting people on board, I think the way that it abuses at the same time as trying to say that it's maintaining the rule of law and how perverse that all is an interesting thing for this time now that might resonate with people as they recognize how corrupt the system itself is.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a good point in the sense that like it feels like quite an important moment with all the Kill the Bill stuff going on, that like the sort of discussions around abolition, around policing, around prisons, around gender-based violence, etc. are like actually happening in a kind of mass movement sense. Like I mean, I'm only 34, but I haven't never really seen that before. Yeah, we've like 3 minutes over, so I guess we'll wrap up. But I just want to say thank you so much all for coming. Like obviously big thanks to Leah, and also sorry, I meant to say, like someone asked about engaging people in conversations about No Borders. I would recommend you get them the book. It is on sale. It's only £5. We have a couple of copies in the library, and it is actually, it's like super accessible, and I think people, it's a very useful resource to have those really like those conversations about No Borders and migrant justice and what that really means for people that are kind of coming from a different place. Yeah, so thank you so much everyone. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the little library. For the very end, I'll just put up a screenshot that's got all the contact details for like Leah, for the Canny Little Library, for the campaign. So please get in touch if you'd like to be involved. Okay, thanks so much everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.